Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mr. Bell. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. The water doesn't lie. That's what my father used to tell me when I was young, watching him cast his lines into the murky depths of the bay. Water shows you exactly what it is, he'd say, his weathered hands steady on the rod. It's people who lie. I've been thinking about those words a lot lately, especially during the long nights when sleep refuses to come. 3 years have passed since that night on the Serenity, but the memory clings to me like algae on a hull, impossible to scrape away completely. My name is Marcus, and I've been living on the water for the better part of a decade. What started as a temporary escape from the suffocating routine of city life became something permanent when I realized that the gentle rocking of my 36-foot cruiser was the only thing that could quiet the constant noise in my head. The boat became my sanctuary, my refuge from a world that had grown too loud, too fast, too demanding. The Serenity was moored in a quiet cove about 15 miles north of Cedar Point, far enough from the marina to avoid the weekend crowds, but close enough to civilization that I could motor in for supplies when needed. The spot was perfect, protected from the worst of the weather by a natural breakwater of rocks, deep enough that I never had to worry about the tide, and isolated enough that I could go days without seeing another soul. That isolation was exactly what I craved. After 23 years of cubicles and conference rooms, of deadlines and performance reviews, of pretending to care about quarterly projections and team-building exercises, the solitude felt like a gift. Out here, the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the hull, the distant cry of seabirds, and the soft hum of my generator when I needed power. I had developed a routine over the years: wake with the sun, usually around 6:30, make coffee on the small galley stove, spend the morning reading or working on small maintenance projects, fish in the afternoon if the weather was good, watch the sunset from the deck with a beer, read until my eyes grew heavy, then sleep to the rhythm of the waves. It was a simple life, but it was mine. No bosses, no schedules, no one expecting anything from me except the Coast Guard inspector who came by once a year to check my safety equipment. I had enough money saved from my previous life to live modestly, and my needs were few. A good book, a functioning engine, and enough fuel to get to shore when I needed supplies. That was all I required. The night everything changed started like any other. I had spent the day replacing some corroded wiring in the engine compartment, tedious work that left my hands grimy and my back sore. The sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and pink, painting the water in colors that no photograph could capture. I cracked open a beer and settled into my deck chair, letting the day's stress melt away as I watched the light fade. The water was unusually calm that evening, like glass reflecting the deepening sky. Not even a whisper of wind disturbed the surface. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish jumping or the distant rumble of a freight train passing through the valley beyond the hills. I remember thinking how perfect it was, how lucky I was to have found this place, this life. The city felt like a distant nightmare, something that had happened to someone else. Out here, I was just another part of the landscape, no more significant than the rocks or the trees. It was a humbling thought, but also a comforting one. As darkness fell, I went below to make dinner. Nothing fancy, just canned soup and a sandwich. I ate while reading a paperback mystery novel, the kind of formulaic story that demanded nothing from me but the willingness to turn pages. The generator hummed softly, powering the cabin lights and keeping the small refrigerator running. Around 10 o'clock, I shut down the generator and switched to battery power for the essential systems. The silence that followed was complete and absolute. I finished my book by the light of an LED lantern, brushed my teeth, and settled into my bunk. The boat rocked gently, a motion so familiar it felt like being held. Sleep came easily that night, deeper than it had been in weeks. I dreamed of swimming in clear water, of diving down to explore coral reefs that couldn't possibly exist in these northern waters. In my dream, the water was so clear I could see for miles in every direction, and fish swam around me in perfect formation, their scales catching the filtered sunlight like scattered coins. I have no idea how long I slept before the sound woke me. In the space between sleeping and waking, I thought it was part of the dream. A dull thud, like something heavy dropping onto sand. But as consciousness returned, I realized the sound was real, and it was coming from somewhere on my boat. My eyes snapped open, and I lay perfectly still, listening. The digital clock on my nightstand showed 2:17 a.m. in glowing red numbers. The boat was still rocking gently, but something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a quality to the silence that made my skin prickle. Then I heard it again, a soft thud, followed by what sounded like something being dragged across the deck. My heart began to race. In all my years of living on the water, I had never had an unexpected visitor. The cove was too isolated, too far from any normal boat traffic. Whatever was making those sounds didn't belong here. I reached for the flashlight I kept beside my bunk, my hand trembling slightly as I wrapped my fingers around the familiar metal cylinder. The sounds continued above me. Footsteps now, definitely footsteps, moving slowly across the deck. Someone was on my boat. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone had found me. Someone had invaded my sanctuary, my refuge from the world. The thought filled me with a rage so pure and immediate that it surprised me. This was my home, my private space, and whoever was up there had no right to be here. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet silent on the cabin floor. The boat's layout was burned into my memory, every step, every obstacle, every potential hiding place. I could navigate it in complete darkness if necessary. That knowledge gave me an advantage over whoever was intruding. As I crept toward the companionway that led to the deck, I tried to think of innocent explanations for what I was hearing. Maybe someone's boat had broken down and they were seeking help. Maybe it was a Coast Guard boarding, though they usually announce themselves. Maybe it was just debris that had washed up against the hull, but deep down I knew better. The sounds were too deliberate, too purposeful. Someone was searching my boat, moving systematically from one end to the other. And they were trying to be quiet about it, which meant they knew I was here and didn't want to wake me. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Why would someone sneak onto my boat in the middle of the night? What did they want? And more importantly, what would they do if they found me? I paused at the bottom of the companionway, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear something else now. A faint scraping sound, like metal against metal. Someone was trying to open something, maybe one of the deck storage compartments. Taking a deep breath, I began to climb the steps as quietly as possible. The companionway was steep and narrow, designed to keep water from entering the cabin during rough weather. Each step felt like it took forever, and I was acutely aware of every small sound I made. The whisper of my clothing against the walls, the soft pad of my feet on the steps, even my own breathing seemed thunderously loud. When I reached the top of the companionway, I paused again. The hatch was closed, but I could see the faint outline of light around its edges. Whoever was on deck had brought a light with them, probably a flashlight or headlamp. That was both good and bad. Good because it meant they couldn't see in the dark any better than I could. Bad because it meant they were prepared for this. The scraping sound continued, now mixed with what sounded like someone rifling through equipment. They were definitely searching for something, going through my gear with a methodical thoroughness that suggested they knew what they were looking for. I pressed my ear to the hatch and listened. The sounds were coming from the stern area, near where I kept my fishing equipment and emergency supplies. I could hear the person moving around, occasionally muttering something too low for me to make out. It was definitely a man's voice, deep and rough. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this a simple robbery? But what would someone want to steal from a boat? My electronics weren't that valuable, and I kept very little cash on board. Was it something more sinister? The isolation that I had come to love suddenly felt like a liability. If something happened to me out here, it could be days before anyone found my body. The thought galvanized me into action. I couldn't just hide below deck hoping the intruder would leave. This was my home, my boat, and I had every right to defend it. Besides, if I stayed hidden, I would be trapped if the person decided to come below deck. I eased the hatch open a fraction of an inch, just enough to peer through. The deck was bathed in the bluish-white glow of an LED flashlight, and I could see a figure crouched near my stern storage locker. He was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be alone, which was something at least. The man was larger than me, probably 6 feet tall and built like someone who did physical labor for a living. His head was shaved or very closely cropped, and he moved with a confidence that suggested he was comfortable with what he was doing. This wasn't his first time breaking into someone's boat. As I watched, he straightened up and turned slightly, giving me a better view of his profile. His face was angular and weathered, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He looked to be in his 40s, maybe older. More importantly, I could see something in his right hand. A knife, its blade gleaming in the flashlight beam. The sight of the weapon sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. This wasn't a simple theft. People didn't bring knives to steal fishing rods and navigation equipment. This man was here for something else, something that might require violence. I had to act. The longer I waited, the more dangerous the situation would become. If he found what he was looking for, he might leave. But if he didn't find it, he might come looking for me. And with that knife in his hand, I didn't want to face him unprepared. I had a few weapons of my own on board. A flare gun, a marine air horn, and a heavy wrench that I kept for engine maintenance. The flare gun was in the wheelhouse, too far away and too risky to reach without being seen. The air horn was in the emergency kit, also on deck, but the wrench was in a tool locker just a few steps from the companionway. Moving as quietly as I could, I eased myself fully onto the deck and crept toward the tool locker. The man was still focused on his search, cursing softly as he pawed through my equipment. I could hear him clearly now, muttering something about "has to be here somewhere," and told me it would be here. The realization that he was looking for something specific, something he believed I had, was both puzzling and terrifying. What could I possibly have that would make someone break into my boat in the middle of the night? I lived a simple life, owned nothing of real value except the boat itself. I reached the tool locker and carefully lifted the lid. The wrench was right where I had left it, its familiar weight reassuring in my hand. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. At least now I had something to defend myself with. That's when he turned around and saw me. For a moment that stretched like an eternity. We just stared at each other. The man's face was a mask of surprise and calculation, his eyes darting between my face and the wrench in my hand. The knife in his grip caught the light as he adjusted his stance, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. Recognition. He knew me. Well, he said, his voice carrying a gravelly quality that spoke of too many cigarettes and too much whiskey. Marcus Rivera, you're a hard man to find. The sound of my name on his lips sent a shock through my system. This wasn't random. This man had come here specifically for me, had tracked me down in my isolated sanctuary. But I couldn't place him, couldn't remember ever seeing that weathered face before. Who are you? I managed to ask, my voice steadier than I felt. What do you want? He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Name's Buck Henley. And what I want is what your brother promised me before he died. The mention of my brother hit me like a physical blow. Jake had been dead for 2 years, killed in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside of Portland. I hadn't spoken to him in months before his death, hadn't seen him in over a year. We had never been close, our lives taking different paths after high school. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I began to remember things. Jake's last phone call, 3 weeks before he died, how desperate he had sounded, how he had begged me to meet him, how I had refused, too caught up in my own problems to deal with his latest crisis. Buck's smile widened. Oh, I think you do, or at least you're starting to. Your brother was into some heavy stuff, Marcus. Owed some very bad people a lot of money. And he told them he had collateral, something valuable that would cover his debts. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. Jake had always been involved in shady deals, always looking for the quick score that would solve all his problems. I had stopped listening to his schemes years ago, had written him off as a lost cause. He said he gave it to you for safekeeping, Buck continued, taking a step closer. Said you didn't know what it was? That he told you it was just some old papers or something, but we both know that's not true, don't we? I genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. Jake had never given me anything to hold for him, had never even visited my boat. The last time we had spoken face-to-face was at our father's funeral 3 years ago, and that conversation had ended in an argument about Jake's lifestyle and choices. You're wrong, I said, backing away from him. Jake never gave me anything. I haven't seen him in... Don't lie to me. Buck's voice exploded across the water, his composure cracking. He told us everything before he died. About the package. About his careful brother who lived on a boat, about how you were the only person he trusted. The knife in his hand was no longer casual. He held it now like someone who knew how to use it, the blade pointed at my chest. I could see the intent in his eyes, the willingness to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. "You're going to help me search this boat," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We're going to go through every inch of it until we find what I'm looking for. And if you cooperate, if you make this easy, maybe I'll let you live." The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact tone, was more terrifying than any threat. This man was a killer. He had done this before, had stood over other people and decided their fate based on his own convenience. The realization filled me with a cold clarity that cut through my fear. I was going to die unless I did something. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Okay, let's look. But I'm telling you, I don't know what you're looking for." Jake and I weren't close. We barely spoke. Buck nodded, but his eyes never left mine. "We'll start with the cabin. Move slow. Keep your hands where I can see them and don't try anything stupid. I've killed 3 people in the last year, and I won't hesitate to make it 4. The casualness of the statement, the way he delivered it like he was discussing the weather, sent a chill through me. This wasn't some desperate amateur. This was a professional, someone who had turned violence into a business. I began to descend the companionway, acutely aware of Buck close behind me. His presence filled the narrow space, making it hard to breathe. I could smell him, sweat, cigarettes, and something else, something metallic that might have been blood. "Turn on the lights," he ordered when we reached the cabin. I flipped the switch, and the LED fixtures cast a harsh white glow over my small living space. In the bright light, everything looked different, foreign. The books on my shelves, the simple furniture, the few personal items I had brought from my old life, all of it seemed to belong to someone else. Buck's eyes scanned the cabin with practiced efficiency. "Nice setup," he said. "Cozy. I can see why you'd want to hide out here. But hiding time's over, Marcus. Time to pay your brother's debts." "What kind of debts?" I asked, hoping to keep him talking while I tried to think of a way out of this situation. "The kind that get you killed if you don't pay them," Buck replied. "Your brother was running drugs for some very serious people. Got caught skimming off the top, thought he could pay them back with interest if he just had a little more time." The picture was becoming clearer, and I didn't like what I was seeing. Jake had always been drawn to easy money, but drug dealing was a new level of stupidity even for him. And somehow, he had dragged me into it. "But time ran out," Buck continued, pulling open drawers and cabinets with systematic thoroughness. "And when it came time to collect, he claimed he had insurance, said he'd stolen something from his employers, something worth a lot more than what he owed." I watched him search, my mind racing. If Jake had hidden something on my boat, where would he have put it? When would he have had the opportunity? I tried to remember his last visit, but it had been so long ago, and I'd been so focused on avoiding him that I hadn't paid attention to what he was doing. "What exactly are you looking for?" I asked. Buck glanced at me, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. Then he shrugged. "Memory card, small, about the size of a fingernail, contains some very sensitive information about some very important people. The kind of information that could put a lot of folks in prison for a very long time." A memory card. That could be hidden anywhere on a boat this size. It could be taped under a cabinet, stuffed inside a book, hidden in the electronics. The search could take hours, maybe days. "And if we don't find it?" I asked. Buck's smile was cold and final. "Then you're no use to me, are you?" The threat was clear. I had to help him find what he was looking for, or I was dead. But even if I helped him, even if we found the memory card, I couldn't see him leaving me alive. I knew too much now, had seen his face, could identify him to the police. The only way out was to fight. I watched him work, noting his movements, his patterns. He was thorough but not particularly careful, tossing my belongings aside as he searched. The knife remained in his hand, but his attention was focused on his search. If I was going to act, it would have to be soon, before he finished with the cabin and moved on to other parts of the boat. He was crouched down, going through the cabinet under the sink when I made my move. The wrench was still in my hand, and I raised it high, aiming for the back of his head. If I could knock him unconscious, I might be able to get the knife away from him, might be able to call for help. But Buck was faster than I expected. Some instinct or peripheral vision alerted him to my movement, and he rolled to the side just as I brought the wrench down. Instead of connecting with his skull, it glanced off his shoulder with a solid thunk. He roared in pain and anger, lashing out with the knife. I jumped back, but the blade caught my shirt, slicing through the fabric and leaving a shallow cut across my ribs. The pain was immediate and sharp, and I could feel warm blood soaking into my shirt. "You stupid son of a bitch," Buck snarled, getting to his feet. "I was going to make this easy for you." He came at me again, the knife held low, ready to thrust upward into my abdomen. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go in the small cabin. My heel caught on the edge of the galley and I stumbled, fighting to keep my balance. Buck pressed his advantage, lunging forward with the knife. I threw myself to the side, crashing into the small dining table. The impact sent dishes and books flying, the sound of breaking glass mixing with Buck's curses and my own ragged breathing. The knife whistled past my ear, embedding itself in the wooden table with a solid thunk. For a moment, Buck struggled to pull it free, and I saw my chance. I swung the wrench with all my strength, connecting with his wrist. The bone snapped with a sound like a branch breaking, and Buck screamed, his hand going limp. But he wasn't finished. Even with a broken wrist, he was larger and stronger than I was. He tackled me, driving me to the floor, his weight crushing down on me. His good hand wrapped around my throat, squeezing with desperate strength. I couldn't breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, and I could feel my strength ebbing away. In desperation, I drove my knee upward, connecting with his groin. He gasped, and his grip loosened just enough for me to gulp in a breath of air. Rolling away from him, I scrambled to my feet and ran for the companionway. I had to get off the boat, had to get away from this madman before he recovered. But as I reached the base of the steps, I heard him behind me, cursing and stumbling but still coming. I burst onto the deck, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. The dinghy was tied to the stern, my only means of escape. If I could reach it, I might be able to get away, might be able to make it to shore and call for help. But Buck was right behind me, and despite his injuries, he was moving fast. I heard his footsteps on the deck, heard him calling my name with a voice full of rage and pain. "You can't run forever, Marcus," he shouted. "I'll find you. I'll hunt you down and make you pay for this." I reached the dinghy and began frantically untying the mooring lines. My hands were shaking, making the simple task nearly impossible. The rope was wet and the knots were tight, refusing to come loose despite my desperate efforts. Behind me, I heard Buck's footsteps getting closer. I glanced back and saw him silhouetted against the cabin lights, his broken wrist held against his chest, his face twisted with pain and fury. He had retrieved the knife from the table, and despite his injury, he held it with deadly purpose. The last knot came free, and I tumbled into the dinghy. The small outboard motor was already tilted down, but I had to prime it and pull the starter cord. In the darkness, with Buck bearing down on me, the familiar process seemed to take forever. I yanked the cord once, twice, 3 times. The engine sputtered, but didn't catch. Buck was at the edge of the deck now, looking down at me with eyes that promised death. "Come back here, you coward," he screamed. "Come back and face me." The 4th pull did it. The engine roared to life and I twisted the throttle, sending the dinghy shooting away from the Serenity. Buck made a desperate leap, trying to land in the small boat, but he was too late. He crashed into the water with a tremendous splash, his curses echoing across the cove. I didn't look back. I pointed the dinghy toward shore and opened the throttle wide, the small engine screaming as it pushed the boat through the water. Behind me I could hear Buck thrashing in the water, but I knew he wouldn't drown. Men like him were too mean to die that easily. The shore was a mile away, but it felt like 100. Every second I expected to hear the sound of the Serenity's engine starting up, to see its lights cutting through the darkness as Buck pursued me. But the night remained quiet except for the sound of my own engine and the splash of water against the dinghy's hull. When I finally reached the rocky beach, I dragged the dinghy up onto the sand and collapsed, my body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. I was alive, but barely. And somewhere out there in the darkness, Buck was still hunting for me. The nightmare was just beginning. The rocks beneath my feet were slick with seaweed and spray, treacherous in the darkness. I picked my way carefully along the shoreline, every few minutes glancing back toward the cove where the Serenity sat like a beacon in the night. Buck's flashlight beam still swept across the water, searching for any sign of me. My ribs burned where his knife had cut me, and I could feel the warm wetness of blood under my shirt. The wound wasn't deep, but it was a constant reminder of how close I had come to death, how close I still was. I needed to reach the main road, needed to flag down a car or find a phone. The nearest house was at least 2 miles inland, through dense woods and rough terrain. In the dark, with Buck potentially behind me, it might as well have been on the moon. The sound of an engine starting up echoed across the water. My heart sank as I saw the Serenity's running lights come on, illuminating the white hull against the black water. Buck had managed to get back aboard, and now he was coming after me. I started running, stumbling over rocks and driftwood, my bare feet finding every sharp edge and obstacle. The shoreline was uneven, a maze of small inlets and rocky outcroppings that forced me to climb and detour constantly. Behind me, the sound of the engine grew louder. The Serenity was fast, capable of 20 knots in good conditions. Buck would reach the shore in minutes, and then he would come after me on foot. I had to get as far away as possible before he made landfall. The woods pressed close to the water's edge, a wall of Douglas fir and cedar that looked impenetrable in the darkness. But somewhere in there was a trail, a path that local hikers used to access the remote beaches. If I could find it, I might be able to put some distance between myself and Buck. I plunged into the tree line, branches whipping at my face and snagging my clothes. The forest was pitch black, forcing me to feel my way from tree to tree. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, made me freeze and listen, wondering if Buck had found me. The trail, when I finally stumbled onto it, was barely visible even in daylight. Now it was just a slightly less dense area of forest, marked by the occasional reflective blaze on a tree trunk. I followed it as best I could, moving as quietly as possible while still making progress. Behind me, I heard the Serenity's engine shut off, followed by the sound of its hull scraping against the rocky shore. Buck was on land now, and the hunt had begun in earnest. I pushed deeper into the woods, using my hands to feel for the trail markers. The path wound upward through the forest, switchbacking up the steep hillside. It was tough going in the dark, but I forced myself to keep moving. Every step took me further from Buck, further from the water where he had almost killed me. The silence was broken by the sound of Buck crashing through the underbrush behind me. He was making no attempt at stealth, apparently confident that he could track me down through brute force. I heard him calling my name, his voice echoing off the trees. "Marcus, you can't hide forever. I know these woods better than you do." I doubted that was true, but it didn't matter. He was bigger and stronger than me, and he had the advantage of not being wounded. If he caught me, it would be over. The trail leveled out as it reached a small clearing, and I paused to catch my breath. My lungs burned, and the cut on my ribs was bleeding more freely now. I needed to rest, but I couldn't afford to stop. Buck's voice was getting closer, and I could hear him moving through the trees with surprising speed. I pressed on, following the trail as it wound through the forest. The trees were older here, their trunks thick enough that I couldn't wrap my arms around them. The canopy was so dense that no starlight filtered through, leaving me in absolute darkness. It was in that darkness that I heard the sound that made my blood freeze, the low, rhythmic panting of something large moving through the forest. For a moment I thought it was Buck, but the sound was wrong. It was too regular, too animal-like. Then I remembered the stories I had heard about this area, tales that the locals told to scare tourists. There were supposed to be bears in these woods, black bears, that had grown bold from years of avoiding human contact. Most of the stories were probably exaggerated, but the fear they inspired was real enough. The panting grew closer, and I pressed myself against a large cedar, trying to become invisible. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure it could be heard for miles. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils, mixed with something else, something musky and animal. A shape moved through the trees about 20 yards away, large and dark against the slightly lighter background of the forest. I held my breath, not daring to move. The shape paused, and I heard the sound of sniffing, as if the animal was trying to identify my scent. Then Buck's voice echoed through the forest again, much closer now. "Marcus, I can smell your blood. You're hurt and you're slowing down." The animal sound faded away, whatever it was, apparently spooked by the human voice. I waited until I was sure it was gone before continuing along the trail. Buck's taunts followed me, but I tried to ignore them. He was trying to psych me out, trying to make me panic and do something stupid. The trail began to descend again, winding down toward what I hoped was the main road. I had hiked these woods a few times over the years, but always in daylight and always with a clear destination in mind. Now, in the darkness, everything looked different. I stumbled over a root and went down hard, my hands scraping against the rough bark of a fallen log. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my injured ribs, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. I lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to determine if Buck had heard me fall. The woods were quiet except for the normal sounds of night. Insects chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. The sound of footsteps moving through the underbrush, coming closer. I got to my feet and kept moving, more carefully now. The trail was getting steeper, and I could see glimpses of lighter sky through the trees ahead. The road had to be close. Then I heard it, the sound of a car engine, distant but unmistakable. The road was just ahead, maybe a few hundred yards through the trees. If I could reach it, if I could flag down a car, I might be able to get help. I abandoned any attempt at stealth and ran for the sound, crashing through the underbrush like a deer fleeing a predator. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my skin, but I didn't care. All that mattered was reaching the road. I burst out of the tree line and found myself standing on the shoulder of Highway 101, the main coastal road. The asphalt was warm under my feet, and the yellow line down the center glowed faintly in the starlight. I had never been so happy to see a piece of civilization. A pair of headlights was approaching from the south, still a mile away but closing fast. I stood in the middle of the road, waving my arms, hoping the driver would see me and stop. The headlights grew brighter, and I could hear the sound of the engine getting louder, but I could also hear something else, the sound of Buck crashing through the forest behind me. He had followed my trail, and he was almost at the road. I had seconds before he reached me. The car was a pickup truck, an old Ford with a rumbling exhaust and a diesel engine that sounded like it was on its last legs. It was slowing down, the driver apparently seeing me in the headlights, but it was still 50 yards away, and Buck was almost on top of me. I heard him break through the tree line behind me, heard his labored breathing and the sound of his footsteps on the asphalt. I turned to face him, and in the glow of the approaching headlights, I saw him clearly for the first time since our fight on the boat. He looked terrible. His clothes were torn, his face was scratched and bleeding, and his broken wrist was swollen to twice its normal size. But his eyes still held that cold determination, and the knife in his good hand glinted in the headlight beams. "End of the line, Marcus," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "No more running." The truck was slowing down, but it was still too far away. The driver was probably trying to figure out what was happening, trying to decide whether to stop or keep going. I had to make a choice, run toward the truck and hope I could reach it before Buck caught me, or stand and fight. I chose to run. Buck was behind me, his footsteps echoing off the asphalt. I could hear him gaining ground, could almost feel the knife at my back. The truck was 20 yards away, now 10. The driver was an older man, his face visible in the glow of the dashboard lights. He was reaching for something, probably a cell phone. I reached the truck just as Buck caught up with me. His good hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. The knife came up, aimed at my chest, but I managed to grab his wrist with both hands. We struggled for control of the weapon, our feet scuffling on the pavement. The truck driver was out of his cab now, a big man in work clothes who looked like he could handle himself. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "Help me!" I gasped, still fighting Buck for the knife. "He's trying to kill me." The driver didn't hesitate. He grabbed Buck from behind, wrapping his arms around the smaller man's chest and lifting him off the ground. Buck thrashed and cursed, but the driver was strong and knew how to handle himself. "Let me go!" Buck screamed. "You don't understand. He's got something that belongs to me." The driver looked at me, taking in my torn clothes and the blood on my shirt. "You okay, son?" I nodded, still catching my breath. "Call the police. This man broke into my boat, tried to kill me. He's looking for something that belonged to my dead brother." The driver's grip tightened on Buck, who was still struggling. "I got a CB radio in the truck. Can reach the sheriff's dispatch from here." But as he spoke, Buck did something I didn't expect. He went limp in the driver's arms, as if he was giving up. The driver's grip loosened slightly, and Buck used that moment to drive his elbow back into the bigger man's ribs. The driver grunted and staggered, his hold loosening. Buck broke free and ran for the woods, disappearing into the darkness before either of us could react. The driver started to follow, but I grabbed his arm. "Let him go," I said. "He's hurt, and he's on foot. The police can track him down." The driver nodded, but he kept watching the tree line where Buck had disappeared. "You sure you're okay? That cut looks pretty deep." I looked down at my shirt, which was soaked with blood. The wound was still bleeding, and I was starting to feel dizzy. "I think I need to get to a hospital." "Hospital's about 10 miles south," the driver said. "I can take you there, but we should call the sheriff first. This guy might come back." We walked to the truck, and the driver, who introduced himself as Pete Morrison, reached for his CB radio. The sheriff's dispatcher answered on the first call, and Pete explained the situation in quick, efficient terms. They promised to send a deputy to the scene and to alert the Coast Guard about the abandoned boat. As we drove toward the hospital, I found myself looking back at the dark woods where Buck had disappeared. He was still out there, still hunting for whatever Jake had hidden. And I had the sinking feeling that this wasn't over. The memory card he was looking for, if it really existed, was still somewhere on the Serenity. And Buck wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. The emergency room at Cedar Point General was a fluorescent-lit nightmare of antiseptic smells and worried faces. I sat on a gurney while a tired-looking nurse cleaned the knife wound on my ribs, her movements efficient but gentle. The cut was deeper than I had thought, requiring 12 stitches and a tetanus shot. "You're lucky," Dr. Patricia Vance said as she finished bandaging the wound. "Another inch to the left and he would have punctured your lung. As it is, you'll be sore for a few weeks, but there shouldn't be any permanent damage." I nodded, only half listening. My mind was still back in the woods, still hearing Buck's voice promising that he would find me. The sedative they had given me was supposed to help me relax, but it only made the memories feel more dreamlike, more unreal. Sheriff's Deputy Rod Castillo arrived just as the doctor was finishing up. He was a young man, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested he took his job seriously. He pulled up a chair beside my bed and opened a small notebook. "I'm going to need to get a statement from you, Mr. Rivera," he said. "Start from the beginning and tell me everything you remember." I told him about waking up to the sound of someone on my boat, about the fight with Buck, about the chase through the woods. I told him about the memory card Buck was looking for, about my brother's debts, and the package he supposedly left with me. Deputy Castillo wrote it all down, occasionally asking for clarification or more details. When I finished, he closed the notebook and looked at me seriously. "We've got units searching the woods, but so far no sign of your attacker. The Coast Guard is going to escort you back to your boat tomorrow to retrieve your belongings and conduct a search. We'll also need to process it as a crime scene." I nodded, though the thought of returning to the Serenity filled me with dread. The boat had been my sanctuary, my refuge from the world. Now it felt contaminated, invaded by violence and the threat of more to come. "There's something else," Deputy Castillo said. "I ran a check on the name you gave me, Buck Henley. He's got a record, mostly drug-related charges, but there's also an outstanding warrant for assault with a deadly weapon from Oregon. If we find him, he's going away for a long time." "And if you don't find him?" I asked. The deputy's expression was grim. "Then you need to be very careful. Men like this don't usually give up. If he really believes you have something that belongs to him, he'll keep looking for you." The words sent a chill through me. I had hoped that Buck's injuries and the police response would be enough to scare him off, but apparently that was wishful thinking. He was still out there, still hunting, still dangerous. "What can I do?" I asked. "First, you need to find somewhere safe to stay while we investigate. Do you have family or friends who could put you up for a while?" I thought about it. I had been living alone for so long that I had lost touch with most of my old friends. My parents were dead and Jake had been my only sibling. There was my cousin Lisa in Portland, but we hadn't spoken in years. "I have a cousin in Portland," I said finally, "but I don't know if she'd want me showing up with this kind of trouble." "It's worth a try," Deputy Castillo said, "just until we can track down Buck Henley and figure out what this is all about." He gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else or if I had any problems. Then he left, and I was alone with my thoughts and the steady beep of the heart monitor. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Buck's face, saw the knife in his hand, felt the weight of his body as he tried to strangle me. The hospital bed felt too soft, too exposed. I kept listening for footsteps in the hallway, for the sound of someone who didn't belong. Around dawn, I called my cousin Lisa. She was surprised to hear from me, but when I explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. "Of course you can stay here," she said. "I've got a spare room, and Jeff's out of town on business anyway. When can you get here?" "Sometime today, I hope. I need to go back to the boat with the police first, collect some things." "Marcus," she said, her voice serious. "Are you sure you're okay? You sound different." I thought about how to answer that. I wasn't okay. I might never be okay again. But I couldn't explain that to Lisa. Couldn't make her understand what it felt like to have your entire world invaded by violence and fear. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." The Coast Guard cutter arrived at Cedar Point Marina just after noon, its white hull cutting through the calm water with military precision. I stood on the dock with Deputy Castillo and 2 other officers watching as the boat approached. The sight of it should have been reassuring, but all I could think about was the last time I had seen the Serenity. The trip to the cove took about 20 minutes. As we approached, I could see my boat floating peacefully at anchor, looking exactly as it had before Buck's invasion. But I knew that appearances were deceiving. The Serenity would never be the same for me. We boarded carefully, the officers going first to make sure the boat was secure. They found evidence of the struggle: overturned furniture, broken dishes, blood on the cabin floor. But there was no sign of Buck, no indication that he had returned. "We'll need to search the boat thoroughly," Deputy Castillo said. "If this memory card exists, we need to find it before he does." The search took hours. Every cabinet, every drawer, every possible hiding place was examined. The officers were thorough but respectful, understanding that this was my home they were tearing apart. I helped as much as I could, trying to think of places Jake might have hidden something without my knowledge. But we found nothing. No memory card, no hidden compartment, no secret stash of anything. If Jake had left something on my boat, it was either very well hidden or Buck had already found it. "Maybe your brother was lying," Deputy Castillo suggested. "Maybe he told this Buck character that he had hidden something with you, but there really isn't anything." It was possible, I supposed. Jake had been desperate, and desperate people often lied to buy themselves time. But if that was the case, it meant Buck was chasing a ghost, and that made him even more dangerous. As the sun began to set, we packed up the evidence and prepared to leave. I gathered some clothes and personal items, enough to last me a few weeks. The officers secured the boat and placed crime scene tape across the companionway. The Serenity was officially a crime scene now, off limits until the investigation was complete. As we motored away from the cove, I looked back at my boat one last time. It looked small and vulnerable in the growing darkness, like a toy forgotten by a child. I wondered if I would ever feel safe there again, if I would ever be able to return to the simple life I had built for myself. The drive to Portland took 4 hours, most of it in silence. I had rented a car at the marina, a small sedan that felt strange after years of living on the water. The motion was all wrong, too steady, too predictable. I found myself missing the gentle rocking of the boat, the way it responded to every wave and current. Lisa lived in a small house in the Hawthorne district, a neighborhood that had been gentrified since I last visited. The house was neat and well-maintained, with a small garden in front and a cat sleeping on the porch. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. She was waiting for me when I arrived, standing in the doorway with a look of concern on her face. Lisa was 2 years younger than me, with the kind of practical intelligence that had served her well in her career as a teacher. She had married young, divorced young, and rebuilt her life with a determination that I admired. "You look terrible," she said, giving me a hug that was careful of my injured ribs. "Thanks," I said. "You always were the diplomat of the family." She laughed, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Come on, let's get you settled. You can tell me all about it over dinner." The spare room was small but comfortable, with a single bed and a desk that looked out onto the backyard. Lisa had put fresh sheets on the bed and left a stack of towels on the dresser. It was the kind of simple kindness that made me realize how isolated I had become. Over dinner, I told her everything about Jake's death, about the phone call I had ignored, about Buck and the memory card and the violence that had shattered my peaceful existence. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. "So this Buck character is still out there," she said when I finished, "and he thinks you have something that belongs to him." "That's about the size of it," I said. "The police are looking for him, but they don't seem optimistic about finding him." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "Marcus," she said finally, "I have to ask, are you sure Jake didn't leave something with you? Something you might have forgotten about or not recognized as important?" I started to say no, but then I remembered something. Jake's last visit to my apartment, about 6 months before I moved to the boat. He had been agitated, nervous, talking about people who were after him. I had thought he was just being paranoid, but maybe there was more to it. "He might have," I said slowly. "When I was packing up my apartment, I found some things he had left there. Books, mostly, and some papers. I threw most of it away, but I kept a few things." "What kind of things?" I tried to remember. There had been a box of old paperbacks, mostly science fiction and mystery novels. Some letters, probably from girlfriends. A few photographs. Nothing that had seemed important at the time. "I put some of it in storage," I said. "There's a unit downtown that I've been paying for but never use. Some of Jake's things might be there." Lisa nodded. "Then maybe we should take a look. If this memory card exists, and if Buck really believes you have it, then you need to find it before he does." The thought of going through Jake's possessions, of revisiting the brother I had tried so hard to forget, filled me with a mixture of dread and curiosity. But Lisa was right. If I was going to have any chance of ending this nightmare, I needed to know what Buck was really after. "Tomorrow," I said. "We'll go tomorrow." That night, I lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside. Cars passed by on the street below, their headlights casting moving shadows on the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. I thought about Jake, about the last time I had seen him alive. He had been asking for help, begging me to listen, but I had been too angry and too tired to care. Now he was dead, and his problems had become my problems. I thought about Buck, somewhere out there in the darkness, planning his next move. He had found me once, had tracked me to my isolated sanctuary. What would stop him from finding me again? And I thought about the memory card, the thing that had started all of this. If it really existed, if it really contained the information Buck claimed, then it was worth killing for. Which meant that as long as people thought I had it, my life was in danger. I had to find it. I had to find it and figure out what to do with it before Buck found me. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams of dark water and bloody knives. The storage facility was a maze of concrete and steel, row upon row of identical units stretching into the distance. I hadn't been there in over a year, and I had trouble remembering which unit was mine. Lisa waited patiently as I walked up and down the aisles, looking for the familiar combination lock. "Number 247, I said finally, stopping in front of a unit that looked exactly like all the others. "This is it." The lock was stiff from disuse, but it opened on the third try. I rolled up the metal door, revealing a small space packed with boxes and furniture from my old life. Everything was covered with a thin layer of dust, testament to how long I had been away. "What are we looking for?" Lisa asked, surveying the jumbled contents. "A box of Jake's things," I said. "Books, papers, photographs. I think I put it in the back." We spent the next hour going through the storage unit, moving boxes and furniture, looking for any trace of my brother's belongings. I found things I had forgotten I owned, photo albums from college, awards from my old job, a guitar I had never learned to play, but no sign of Jake's box. "Maybe you threw it away after all," Lisa suggested. I was beginning to think she was right when I found it, wedged between a filing cabinet and a stack of moving boxes. It was smaller than I remembered, just a cardboard box with Jake's stuff written on it in my own handwriting. but it was definitely the right box. We carried it out to Lisa's car and drove back to her house. I felt strangely nervous about opening it, as if I was violating some kind of sacred trust. But Jake was dead, and whatever secrets he had kept were now mine to deal with. The box contained exactly what I remembered: a stack of paperback novels, some letters, a few photographs. But as I went through it more carefully, I began to notice things I had missed before. The books were all from the same series, a set of science fiction novels about space exploration. That was odd, because Jake had never been interested in science fiction. "Look at this," Lisa said, holding up one of the books. "It's been hollowed out." She was right. The book had been carefully cut with a razor blade, creating a small cavity in the pages. But the cavity was empty, containing nothing but a few scraps of paper. We checked the other books in the series and found that 3 of them had been similarly modified. All were empty, but in one of them I found something that made my blood run cold: a small piece of paper with Buck's name and phone number written on it. "He knew him," I said, showing Lisa the paper. "Jake knew Buck before any of this started." "Maybe Buck was the one who got him into drugs," Lisa suggested. "Maybe they were partners." I thought about it, and it made sense. Jake had always been drawn to get-rich-quick schemes, and Buck had the look of someone who made his living from other people's weaknesses. They would have been natural partners. But if that was the case, why had Buck come after me? Why did he think I had something that belonged to him? The answer came to me as I was going through the photographs. Most of them were old, pictures from our childhood and teenage years. But there was one that was newer, a color photo that showed Jake standing next to a fishing boat. He was smiling, holding up a large salmon, but it was the boat that caught my attention. It was the Serenity. "When was this taken?" Lisa asked, looking over my shoulder. I turned the photo over. Written in Jake's handwriting was a date, just 3 months before he died. 3 months before he died, and 2 months before I moved to the boat. "He knew about the boat," I said. "He knew where I was going to be living." The implication was clear. If Jake had known about the Serenity, if he had visited it before I moved aboard, then he could have hidden something there. The memory card Buck was looking for might really exist, might really be hidden somewhere on my boat. But if that was the case, why hadn't we found it? We had searched every inch of the boat, had looked in every possible hiding place. Where could Jake have hidden something so that even a thorough search wouldn't find it? I was still puzzling over this when Lisa's phone rang. She answered it with a cheerful "hello," but her expression quickly changed to one of concern. "Marcus," she said, holding out the phone. "It's for you, someone named Buck." My blood turned to ice. "How did he get this number?" "I don't know, but he says he wants to talk to you." I took the phone with shaking hands. Buck's voice was calm, almost friendly, but I could hear the menace underneath. "Hello, Marcus. I hope you're feeling better. How did you find me?" "I'm very good at finding people, Marcus. It's one of my talents. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I have something you want." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your boat. I'm back on the Serenity, Marcus, and I have to say, it's very peaceful out here. Very isolated. The kind of place where anything could happen." The phone almost slipped from my hands. "You're lying. The boat is sealed off. It's a crime scene." Buck's laugh was cold and humorless. "Crime scene tape doesn't stop someone who knows what they're doing, Marcus. And I know exactly what I'm doing." "What do you want?" "I want what your brother promised me. I want the memory card, and I think you know where it is." "I don't know anything about any memory card. We searched the boat from top to bottom." "Maybe you searched, but you didn't find it, which means it's hidden better than you thought. But I'm betting you can figure out where it is, if you put your mind to it." There was a pause, and when Buck spoke again, his voice had a deadly edge. "Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. You're going to come back to your boat. You're going to bring the memory card with you. And then we're going to have a little chat about your brother's debts. And if I don't? Then I'm going to start taking this boat apart piece by piece until I find what I'm looking for, and when I'm done, I'm going to burn it to the waterline. Your little floating home will be nothing but ash and debris." The threat hit me like a physical blow. The Serenity was more than just a boat. It was my home, my sanctuary, my entire life. The thought of Buck destroying it filled me with a rage I didn't know I possessed. "You son of a bitch," I said. Now, Marcus. No need for name-calling. I'm just a businessman trying to collect a debt. You come out here, you bring me what I want, and nobody gets hurt. You have 2 hours." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, my mind racing. Buck was on my boat, threatening to destroy it if I didn't give him something I didn't have. But the photograph suggested that Jake really had hidden something on the Serenity, something that Buck believed was worth killing for. "What are you going to do?" Lisa asked. I thought about it. I could call the police, but they would take hours to get a boat out to the cove. By then, Buck might have carried out his threat. I could try to ignore him, but that would just delay the inevitable. Buck had found me once, and he would find me again. Or I could go back to the boat and face him. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, but it was also the only way to end this nightmare once and for all. "I'm going back," I said. "That's crazy, Marcus. He'll kill you." "Maybe, but if I don't go, he'll destroy the boat, and then he'll come after me anyway. At least this way, I have a chance to end it." Lisa started to argue, but I cut her off. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to call the police, tell them what's happening. Give them about an hour, then send them to the cove. If I'm not back by morning, tell them to look for my body." The drive back to the coast took 3 hours, but it felt like 3 minutes. I kept replaying the conversation with Buck, trying to figure out what he really wanted. If the memory card existed, if it really was hidden on the Serenity, then where would Jake have put it? The answer came to me as I was pulling into the marina parking lot. Jake had been on the boat, had taken that photograph, but he had also been smart enough to hide the memory card somewhere that a casual search wouldn't find it, which meant it wasn't hidden inside the boat. It was hidden as part of the boat. I rented a small motorboat from the marina, telling the owner that I needed to check on my boat. He was reluctant to let me go out after dark, but I convinced him that it was an emergency. I promised to be back by morning. The trip to the cove was a nightmare of anxiety and anticipation. I kept the throttle low, trying to approach quietly, but the sound of the engine echoed off the water like thunder. If Buck was listening, he would know I was coming. The Serenity was exactly where I had left it, floating peacefully in the protected cove. But as I approached, I could see lights in the cabin, and I knew that Buck was waiting for me. I tied the rental boat to the stern and climbed aboard. The deck was littered with debris, cushions, equipment, pieces of the interior that Buck had torn apart in his search. He had been busy while I was gone. "Welcome home, Marcus," Buck's voice came from the cabin. "Come on down, we have a lot to talk about." I descended the companionway slowly, my hands visible and empty. Buck was sitting at the small dining table, the knife within easy reach. He looked tired, but determined, and I could see that his broken wrist was crudely splinted. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure you would. You threatened to destroy my boat, and I meant it. But now that you're here, maybe we can work something out. You give me what I want, and I leave you alone. Simple as that." I looked around the cabin. Buck had been thorough. Every drawer was open, every cabinet emptied, every cushion torn apart. But he hadn't found what he was looking for. "It's not here," I said. "Oh, but it is. Your brother was too smart to hide it anywhere else. He knew that as long as it was on this boat, it would be safe. The only question is where." Buck stood up, the knife in his hand. "So let's figure it out together. Where would your brother hide something so that even you wouldn't know it was there?" I thought about Jake, about how his mind worked. He had always been clever, always thinking one step ahead. If he had hidden something on the Serenity, he would have chosen a place that was both secure and accessible. And then I knew. "The hull," I said. "He hid it in the hull." Buck's eyes lit up. "Where?" "The propeller shaft housing. There's a small access panel that's only visible from underwater. Jake was a good swimmer. He could have dove down and hidden it there." Buck smiled. "Then let's go take a look." We went up on deck, and Buck forced me to put on diving gear while he held the knife. The water was black and cold, but the Serenity's underwater lights illuminated the hull clearly. I dove down to the propeller shaft, my heart pounding with more than just the exertion. The access panel was exactly where I remembered it, a small cover that protected the shaft bearings. I had never opened it, had never had any reason to, but when I pried it open with a screwdriver, I found exactly what I expected. A small waterproof container wedged inside. I brought it to the surface and Buck pulled me back onto the boat. Inside the container was a micro SD card, barely larger than a fingernail. It was exactly what Buck had been looking for. "Finally," Buck said, taking the card from my hand. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me?" "It's over now," I said. "You've got what you wanted." Buck shook his head. "Not quite. See, you know too much now. You know who I am, what I do. You could identify me to the police." The knife was in his hand again, and I saw my death in his eyes. He had never intended to let me live. The memory card was just the beginning, but I had been expecting this. While Buck was examining the SD card, I had been slowly reaching for the emergency flare gun I kept in the cockpit. Now I pulled it out and aimed it at his chest. "Drop the knife," I said. Buck looked at the flare gun and laughed. "You're not going to shoot me with that. It's a flare gun, not a real weapon." "A flare burns at over 2,000 degrees, I said. "Want to find out what that feels like?" Buck's expression changed, and I saw doubt in his eyes. He started to lower the knife, but then he lunged forward, trying to knock the flare gun from my hand. I pulled the trigger. The flare struck Buck in the chest, and he screamed as his shirt burst into flames. He stumbled backwards, slapping at the fire, but the phosphorus was burning too hot to extinguish. He fell to the deck, writhing in agony. I grabbed the fire extinguisher and put out the flames, but it was too late. Buck lay still, his chest a mass of burned flesh. The memory card had fallen from his hand and was lying on the deck beside him. I picked it up and looked at it. Such a small thing to cause so much death and destruction. Whatever information it contained, it wasn't worth what it had cost. In the distance, I could hear the sound of boat engines approaching. Lisa had called the police, and they were coming to investigate. I would have to explain what had happened, would have to justify killing Buck in self-defense. But as I looked down at his body, I felt no remorse. He had invaded my home, threatened my life, and tried to destroy everything I cared about. He had gotten exactly what he deserved. I threw the memory card into the water and watched it sink into the dark depths. Whatever secrets it contained would stay hidden forever. Some things were better left buried. The police boats arrived 20 minutes later, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. I raised my hands and waited for them to board, ready to tell my story one more time. It was over. Buck was dead, the memory card was gone, and I was finally free. The Serenity was damaged but repairable, and I was alive. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and I could finally go home. The first time I saw the house on Sycamore Street, I knew something was wrong with it. Not wrong in the way a foundation settles or pipes leak, but wrong in a way that made my stomach turn and my palms sweat. My wife Rebecca stood beside me on the cracked sidewalk, her real estate license gleaming in the afternoon sun as she flipped through the property details. "It's been on the market for 8 months, she said, not looking up from her paperwork. "The price has dropped 3 times. We could get it for almost 40% under market value." I stared at the Victorian's peeling paint and sagging porch. The windows seemed to watch us, black and empty despite the daylight. A for sale sign tilted at an odd angle in the overgrown front yard, and I noticed several others buried beneath weeds and debris, evidence of previous failed attempts to sell. "Why so cheap?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. Rebecca finally looked up, her blonde hair catching the light. "The previous owners. There was an incident. A family named the Hendersons. They only lived here 6 months before they moved out suddenly. Left most of their furniture behind." She handed me a folder thick with documents. Inside, I found police reports, insurance claims, and medical records. The Hendersons had reported strange noises, unexplained injuries, and what they described as persistent, supernatural activity. Mrs. Henderson had been hospitalized twice for what doctors called severe psychological distress. Their teenage son had been found wandering the streets at 3 a.m., claiming something was chasing him through the house. The family before them lasted only 3 months, Rebecca continued. The Kowalskis, similar complaints. Before that, the Brennans, 2 months. The pattern goes back about 5 years. I counted the abandoned for sale signs again. 7 different real estate agencies had tried to sell this property. The most recent listing agent had quit after reporting that he'd been locked inside the house during a showing, with no one else present to explain how the deadbolt had engaged from the inside. "We need the money," Rebecca said softly. "The commission on this sale would cover Mom's medical bills and give us enough for a down payment on our own place." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Rebecca's mother had been fighting cancer for 2 years, and the treatments had drained our savings. Rebecca had just gotten her real estate license, and this sale represented her first real opportunity to make a significant income. The house stood 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and ornate Victorian details that had once been beautiful. Now the gingerbread trim hung loose in places, and several shutters had fallen off entirely. The roof showed signs of water damage, and the chimney had partially collapsed. "Tell me about the original owners," I said, still studying the police reports. Rebecca flipped to another section of the folder. The house was built in 1894 by a man named Jeremiah Crowley. He was a local businessman who made his fortune in the lumber industry. He lived here with his wife and 3 children until 1899, when there was a fire. The fire had started in the basement, according to the historical records. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the entire first floor was engulfed. Jeremiah Crowley had died trying to save his family, but only his wife survived. She'd been found in the backyard, catatonic and severely burned. She never spoke again and died in an asylum 3 years later. "The house was rebuilt in 1901, Rebecca continued. "New owners moved in, but they reported strange occurrences almost immediately. Cold spots, unexplained sounds, objects moving on their own. They sold after 1 year." I read through more of the historical documentation. The pattern was consistent. Families would move in, experience increasingly disturbing phenomena, and leave within months. The longest any family had stayed was 18 months, and they'd left suddenly after their youngest daughter had fallen down the stairs and broken her neck. She'd survived, but claimed someone had pushed her. "The current owners live in Florida now," Rebecca said. "They inherited the property from an aunt who died last year. They've never even seen it in person. They just want it gone." I looked at the house again, noting how the shadows seemed to gather around it even in broad daylight. The windows on the second floor were boarded up, but I could swear I saw movement behind the slats, a curtain twitching, or perhaps just my imagination playing tricks. "What about inspections?" I asked. "Structural issues? Environmental hazards?" Rebecca produced another thick folder. 3 separate inspections over the past year. The structure is sound, surprisingly. No asbestos, no lead paint, no mold. Plumbing and electrical were updated in 2018. Mechanically, it's perfect. The inspection reports were thorough and professional. Every system checked out. The foundation was solid, the roof was new, and the HVAC system was state-of-the-art. On paper, it was a beautiful home that should have sold immediately. "The inspectors did note some unusual findings," Rebecca said, pointing to a section I'd missed. "Temperature variations between rooms that couldn't be explained by the heating system, electromagnetic readings that spiked randomly, and all 3 inspectors reported feeling uneasy in the basement." I read the inspector's notes more carefully. One had written, "Persistent feeling of being watched. Recommend psychological evaluation of property." Another had noted, "Client should be aware of property's history before purchase." The third had simply written, "Would not recommend this property for family habitation." "We don't have to live here," Rebecca said quickly. "We could flip it, fix it up, stage it nicely, sell it to someone who doesn't know the history." I thought about our situation. Rebecca's mother needed surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. We'd been living in a cramped apartment, saving every penny. The commission on this sale would change our lives, and if we could buy the house cheap enough, we might even make a profit flipping it. "What's the asking price?" I asked. $200,000. We could probably get it for $170. I did the math. Houses in this neighborhood typically sold for $400,000 or more. Even accounting for the stigma, we'd be getting an incredible deal. We could put $50,000 into renovations and still make a substantial profit. "I want to see the inside," I said. Rebecca nodded and pulled out a key. "The current owners gave me full access. They said to sell it for whatever we could get." We walked up the porch steps, which creaked ominously under our weight. The front door was solid oak with ornate glass panels. though several were cracked. Rebecca unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell hit me immediately. Not the mustiness I'd expected from a house that had been empty for months, but something else. Something organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left out too long. Rebecca wrinkled her nose but didn't comment. The interior was stunning, despite the odor. High ceilings with ornate molding, original hardwood floors that gleamed even under dust, a grand staircase with carved banisters. The Henderson family had left behind expensive furniture, artwork, and electronics. It looked like they'd fled in the middle of the night. Why didn't they take their things, I asked, running my hand along a mahogany dining table that must have cost thousands. Mrs. Henderson said she never wanted to see anything from this house again, Rebecca replied. She told the movers to burn it all, but they convinced her to leave it for the next owners instead. We moved through the first floor, examining each room. The living room contained a massive stone fireplace with scorch marks that seemed too fresh for a house that had been empty for months. The kitchen was modern and well-appointed, but several cabinet doors hung open, and the refrigerator was unplugged and standing ajar. The basement, I said, remembering the inspector's comments. Rebecca hesitated. We don't have to go down there today. The main living areas are what matter for resale value. But I was already heading toward the basement door, which stood slightly ajar. The smell was stronger here, and I noticed the door frame was scratched and gouged, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. I flipped the light switch and descended the wooden steps. The basement was finished with paneling and drop-ceiling tiles converted into a recreation room. There was a bar area, a pool table, and comfortable seating. It should have been inviting, but instead it felt oppressive and cold. The temperature difference was immediately noticeable. While the first floor had been pleasantly warm, the basement was at least 20 degrees cooler. I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. This is where the original fire started, Rebecca said from behind me, in 1899. I examined the walls more closely. Behind the 1970s paneling, I could see evidence of fire damage, charred beams and scorched stone. But there was something else. Scratches in the wood, deep gouges that looked deliberate, and stains on the concrete floor that had been partially covered by area rugs. What are those stains? I asked. Rebecca knelt beside me, pulling back one of the rugs. The stains were dark and irregular, spreading across several square feet of concrete. They looked like they could be water damage, but the pattern was wrong, too organic, too deliberate. Probably just water damage from the old plumbing, she said, but her voice was uncertain. I was about to respond when we heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the hardwood floors of the living room. Did you leave the front door open? I asked. Rebecca's face went pale. I locked it behind us. We stood frozen, listening. The footsteps continued, moving from the living room toward the kitchen. They were heavy, like boots on hardwood, and they followed a deliberate pattern. Walk, pause, walk, pause. Hello? I called out. Is someone there? The footsteps stopped immediately. We waited in the basement, listening to the silence above. After several minutes, I started toward the stairs. Don't, Rebecca whispered. Let's just leave. We can come back tomorrow with other people. But I was already halfway up the stairs. The basement door, which had been open when we came down, was now closed. I tried the handle. It was locked from the other side. Rebecca, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, the door is locked. She joined me at the top of the stairs and tried the handle herself. It wouldn't budge. There was no lock on the basement side of the door, only a simple handle that should have opened easily. There has to be another way out, she said, looking around the basement frantically. I checked every corner, every panel, every possible exit. The basement had no windows, no outside access, no other doors. The only way out was through the locked door at the top of the stairs. We were trapped. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The phone showed full bars upstairs, but here in the basement, nothing. Try yours, I said. Rebecca's phone showed the same thing. No signal, no way to call for help. Above us, the footsteps resumed. They were moving more quickly now, back and forth across the first floor. Then we heard something else. Voices. Muffled conversation. Too quiet to make out the words. There's someone in the house, Rebecca whispered. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear more clearly. The voices were definitely there, but they sounded strange, distorted, like they were coming from very far away or through some kind of interference. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices was calling my name. "Did you hear that?" I asked Rebecca. She nodded, her face white with terror. "It sounded like your voice. But you're right here." The voice came again, clearer this time. It was definitely my voice calling Rebecca's name from somewhere upstairs. But I hadn't said anything. "What is this place?" Rebecca whispered. I didn't have an answer. I only knew that we needed to get out immediately. I threw my shoulder against the door, but it held firm. The wood was solid oak, and whatever was holding it closed was stronger than I was. "Help me," I said, and together we slammed against the door. It burst open suddenly, sending us tumbling into the first-floor hallway. The house was silent now, no footsteps, no voices. But the temperature had dropped significantly, and that organic smell was stronger than ever. "The car," Rebecca said. "Now." We ran toward the front door, but it was locked. The deadbolt was engaged, and Rebecca's key wouldn't turn. We were still trapped, but now we had more room to move. "Back door," I said, and we ran toward the kitchen. The back door was also locked, but this one had a window. I grabbed a chair and smashed it through the glass, then carefully climbed through. Rebecca followed, and we ran around the house to our car. Once we were safely inside with the doors locked, we sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what had happened. "We're not buying this house," Rebecca said finally. I nodded, but even as I agreed, I was thinking about the commission, about her mother's medical bills, about the opportunity we'd be passing up. "Maybe we just need to understand what we're dealing with," I said. "Research the history more thoroughly. Find out what really happened here." Rebecca looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What really happened is that this house is haunted by ghosts. Multiple ghosts. And they don't want people living here." She was right, of course. But as we drove away, I found myself looking back at the house in the rearview mirror. It looked normal in the fading afternoon light, almost inviting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd left something unfinished. That night, I started researching the house's history online. What I found made me realize that our experience in the basement was just the beginning. I spent the next 3 days buried in research, barely sleeping, consuming every piece of information I could find about the house on Sycamore Street. What I discovered made me question everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. The Crowley family's story was just the tip of the iceberg. Jeremiah Crowley hadn't been the upstanding businessman the historical records suggested. I found newspaper articles from the 1890s that painted a very different picture. Crowley had been investigated for the disappearances of several local children. No charges were ever filed, but the investigation had been ongoing when the fire occurred. The children had vanished over a period of 18 months, all from families who lived within a few blocks of the Crowley house. The fire itself was suspicious. The official report claimed it started from a faulty oil lamp in the basement, but witnesses reported seeing someone running from the house just before the flames erupted. A neighbor had told police that she'd heard children screaming from the basement, but when investigators searched the ruins, they found only the bodies of Crowley and his 3 children. Mrs. Crowley, the sole survivor, had been found in the backyard in a catatonic state. But according to medical records I found in the city archives, she'd been pregnant when she was admitted to the asylum. She'd given birth to a stillborn child 3 months after the fire, and the birth certificate listed severe burns and developmental abnormalities as contributing factors. The abnormalities were described in clinical terms that made my stomach turn. The infant had been born with what appeared to be claw marks covering its body, and its bones showed signs of having been broken and reset multiple times while still in the womb. I printed out everything I found and spread it across our kitchen table. Rebecca watched me work, growing more concerned with each passing hour. "You need to let this go," she said on the 3rd day. "We're not buying the house. End of story." But I couldn't let it go. I'd found something in the city records that changed everything. "Look at this," I said, showing her a property deed from 1901. The house wasn't rebuilt by new owners. It was rebuilt by the city, using funds from a federal grant. Rebecca examined the document. "So?" Federal grants for house reconstruction didn't exist in 1901. This money came from somewhere else, and whoever provided it wanted the house rebuilt exactly as it was before. I showed her architectural drawings from the reconstruction. They were identical to the original plans, down to the smallest detail. Even the basement layout was preserved, including what appeared to be hidden rooms that weren't mentioned in any of the official documents. "There's something else," I said, pulling out a folder of medical records. "Every family that's lived in that house has reported the same symptoms: unexplained injuries, psychological distress, and..." I paused, checking my notes. "Pregnancy complications." Rebecca's face went pale. "What kind of complications?" "Miscarriages, stillbirths, birth defects, always within the first year of living in the house, and the children who were born alive. They all showed signs of premature aging and psychological trauma." I'd found records spanning more than a century. 23 families had lived in the house since 1901, and 31 children had been born to those families. Only 7 had survived to adulthood, and all of them had been institutionalized for various mental health issues. "This is about more than ghosts," I said. "There's something in that house that feeds on families, on children specifically." Rebecca backed away from the table. "Stop. I don't want to hear anymore." But I was already deep into the research, and I'd found something that made everything click into place. In the basement of the city library, I'd discovered a collection of personal papers donated by the estate of Dr. Marcus Whitmore, who'd been the attending physician at the asylum where Mrs. Crowley had been treated. Dr. Whitmore had been fascinated by Mrs. Crowley's case. His notes described her symptoms in detail. She would sit motionless for hours, then suddenly begin speaking in voices that weren't her own. Children's voices pleading for help, describing terrible things that had been done to them. During these episodes, Mrs. Crowley would provide specific details about the missing children, their names, their appearances, what they'd been wearing when they disappeared, information she couldn't have known unless she'd been present when they were taken. Dr. Whitmore had interviewed Mrs. Crowley extensively, and his notes painted a picture of something far more sinister than a simple house fire. According to her testimony, Jeremiah Crowley had been part of a group that practiced what they called spiritual cultivation. They believed that by sacrificing children in specific rituals, they could create a permanent connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. The basement of the house had been modified for these rituals. Hidden rooms had been constructed behind false walls, and the entire area had been blessed according to occult practices that were supposed to trap souls and prevent them from passing into the afterlife. Mrs. Crowley claimed that her husband had killed dozens of children over the years, not just the few who had been reported missing. The bodies were buried in the basement walls, and their spirits were bound to the house through the ritual sacrifices. The fire, she said, hadn't been an accident. It had been set by the surviving children, the ghosts of Crowley's victims, who had finally found a way to strike back. They'd killed Crowley and his family, but they'd been unable to free themselves from the house. The binding rituals had worked too well. Dr. Whitmore's notes became increasingly frantic as he continued his research. He'd visited the house multiple times, interviewing subsequent owners and documenting the supernatural phenomena. His final entries described his growing conviction that the house was actively evil and that someone needed to find a way to release the trapped spirits. The last entry in his journal was dated December 15, 1905. "I have found the key. The children can be freed, but only through a reversal of the original ritual. I will attempt this tomorrow night. If I fail, I pray that someone else will continue this work." Dr. Whitmore had been found dead in the basement of the house on December 16, 1905. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the circumstances were suspicious. He'd been found surrounded by occult symbols drawn in what appeared to be blood, and his body showed signs of severe trauma that couldn't be explained by cardiac arrest. I showed Rebecca the journal entries, watching her face grow more troubled with each page. "If this is true," she said finally, "then that house is a prison. Those ghosts aren't evil. They're victims." I nodded. "And every family that moves in becomes part of the cycle. The house feeds on their fear, their pain, their children. It's been happening for over a century." Rebecca was quiet for a long time, studying the documents. Finally, she looked up at me with the expression I'd never seen before. "We have to buy it," she said. "What?" "We have to buy it and find a way to stop this." Those children have been trapped for more than 100 years. If we don't help them, who will? I stared at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. Rebecca, this is insane. We're talking about moving into a house that's killed dozens of people. The house hasn't killed anyone, she said. Jeremiah Crowley killed them. The house is just where they're trapped. And according to Dr. Whitmore's research, there's a way to free them. She was right, but the idea terrified me. Everything I'd learned about the house suggested that it was impossibly dangerous. The ghosts might be victims, but they were also desperate and potentially violent. Every family that had tried to live there had been driven out, or worse. Even if we could figure out how to perform the ritual, I said, we'd have to live in the house while we did it. We'd be exposing ourselves to the same dangers that drove out everyone else. Rebecca picked up one of the medical records, a report about a stillborn child born to a family that had lived in the house for only 6 weeks. This baby would have been born healthy if its parents hadn't lived in that house, she said. How many children have suffered because no one was willing to take the risk? I thought about the research I'd done, about the decades of families who'd moved in with hope and been destroyed by forces they couldn't understand. The house had been for sale almost continuously for 5 years, and every few months, another family would try to make it work. The cycle would continue indefinitely unless someone found a way to break it. Okay, I said finally. But we do this smart. We research everything we can about the original rituals. We prepare for what we might encounter, and we have an exit strategy if things go wrong. Rebecca nodded. And we don't tell anyone what we're really doing. As far as everyone else knows, we're just flipping a house. I spent the next week diving deeper into occult research, trying to understand what Jeremiah Crowley had done and how it might be reversed. The more I learned, the more complex the situation became. The rituals Crowley had performed were based on a combination of European witchcraft and Native American spiritual practices. He'd created what occultists called a soul prison, a physical location where spirits could be bound indefinitely. The basement of the house had been modified to serve as a focus point for these bindings, with specific symbols and materials built into the structure itself. But the binding wasn't just magical, it was psychological. The trapped spirits had been children when they died, and more than a century of imprisonment had damaged them in ways that went beyond simple trauma. They'd become fragments of their former selves, driven by pain and confusion and a desperate need to escape. The reversal ritual would be dangerous not just because of the supernatural elements, but because freeing the spirits might unleash a century of accumulated rage and suffering. We'd be opening a door that had been locked for very good reasons. I found references to similar cases in occult literature. Houses, buildings, even entire towns that had been spiritually contaminated by ritual violence. In most cases, the solution had been abandonment or destruction. I found only 3 documented cases where bound spirits had been successfully freed, and in 2 of those cases, the people who performed the rituals had died in the process. But I also found something else, references to protective measures that could be taken during the ritual. Specific symbols, prayers, and materials that could shield the living from the spiritual backlash. The information was fragmentary and contradictory, but it suggested that the ritual could be performed safely with proper preparation. 2 weeks after our initial visit, we made an offer on the house. The owners accepted immediately, and we scheduled the closing for the following month. We had 30 days to prepare for what might be the most dangerous thing we'd ever attempted. I quit my job and devoted myself to full-time research. Rebecca continued working, but she spent her evenings helping me gather materials and plan our approach. We told our families that we were taking a risk on a fixer-upper, which was true enough. The hardest part was the waiting. Every day that passed was another day that families might be looking at the house, another chance that someone else might move in and become victims. I found myself obsessively checking the real estate listings, making sure our offer was still the only one pending. 3 days before the closing, I made one final trip to the house. I wanted to examine the basement more thoroughly, to look for the hidden rooms that Dr. Whitmore had mentioned in his notes. I brought a professional metal detector and a set of architectural drawings that I'd commissioned from the city planning office. If there were hidden spaces behind the basement walls, I needed to know exactly where they were. The house felt different this time, still cold, still oppressive, but also somehow expectant. as if it knew what we were planning and was waiting to see if we'd actually go through with it. I spent 3 hours in the basement, methodically scanning every wall and floor section. The metal detector picked up several anomalies, areas where the readings suggested hollow spaces behind what appeared to be solid walls. I found 3 hidden rooms, exactly as Dr. Whitmore had described. They were small, maybe 8 feet square each, and they were located behind the paneling on the north wall. The entrances had been sealed with plaster and painted over, but I could see the outline of doors when I looked closely. I also found something else, scratch marks on the walls that hadn't been there during our first visit. They were fresh, deep gouges in the wood paneling that spelled out words, "Help us," "Please," "So cold." The scratches were at child height, and they appeared to have been made by fingernails rather than tools. As I examined them more closely, I noticed that some of them were still bleeding, not blood, but a dark, viscous substance that smelled like decay. I took photographs of everything and left the house quickly. The closing was in 3 days, and after that, we'd be moving into a place that housed the spirits of dozens of murdered children. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt a strange sense of purpose. For the first time in my life, I was going to do something that really mattered. We were going to free those children, no matter what it cost us. What I didn't realize was that the house had already begun changing us. The research, the planning, the constant exposure to the dark history, it was all part of the process. By the time we moved in, we would no longer be the same people who had first walked through that front door. The house had been waiting for us, and now it was ready to begin our education. The moving truck arrived at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late October. Rebecca and I had spent the previous week packing our apartment, trying to bring as little as possible into the house. We'd read enough accounts from previous residents to know that the supernatural activity seemed to intensify around personal possessions, as if the ghosts were drawn to items that carried emotional significance. I stood on the sidewalk watching the movers unload our belongings, noting how they worked quickly and avoided making eye contact with the house. The crew chief, a man named Rodriguez, who'd been moving families for 20 years, kept glancing at the windows as if he expected to see something looking back. "You folks know about this place?" he asked me quietly while his crew carried boxes up the front steps. "We've heard the stories," I said. "We're not concerned." Rodriguez shook his head. "I've moved 5 families out of this house, never moved anyone in. You sure about this?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure about anything. The research I'd done had prepared me intellectually for what we might encounter, but standing in front of the house with our possessions being carried inside, the reality of our situation hit me with full force. Rebecca appeared at my side, carrying a box of books. "The movers found something in the basement," she said. "You need to see this." I followed her down the basement stairs, where 2 of the movers were standing beside the hidden wall I'd examined weeks earlier. The paneling had been removed, revealing a doorway that was now standing open. "It was like this when we came down," one of the movers said. "Wasn't open when we started." I approached the doorway carefully. The space beyond was small and dark, with stone walls that looked much older than the rest of the house. The air that came from the opening was cold and carried that same organic smell I'd noticed before, but stronger now. "Just leave everything upstairs," I told the movers. "We'll handle the basement ourselves." They didn't argue. Within an hour, they'd finished unloading the truck and left without accepting the tip I offered. Rodriguez handed me his card as he climbed into the cab. "Call me if you change your mind," he said. "I'll move you out for free." Once the movers were gone, Rebecca and I stood in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes and furniture. The house felt different now that it contained our possessions. More alive somehow, more aware of our presence. "We should start with the protective measures," Rebecca said, "before we do anything else." I'd spent weeks researching spiritual protection methods, comparing different traditions and techniques. The most consistent advice came from practitioners who had dealt with similar situations: salt barriers, iron objects, and specific symbols that were supposed to prevent spirits from directly harming the living. We started with the salt. I'd purchased 50 pounds of sea salt, which according to my research was more effective than regular table salt for spiritual purposes. We spread it across every threshold in the house: doorways, windows, even the basement entrance. The iron was more complex. I'd commissioned a blacksmith to create specific shapes based on symbols I'd found in Dr. Whitmore's notes. They were supposed to be hung at cardinal points throughout the house, creating a protective grid that would contain any spiritual activity. As I hung the first iron piece near the front door, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air in the room became so cold that I could see my breath, and for a moment I thought I heard children's voices whispering just at the edge of hearing. Rebecca was in the kitchen, spreading salt across the back door threshold. "Did you feel that?" she called. "The cold?" "Yes. Not just the cold. It felt like someone was watching me, standing right behind me." I joined her in the kitchen, noting that the temperature here was normal. Whatever had caused the cold in the living room was localized and temporary. "They know we're here," I said. "They know we're different from the other families." We continued with the protective measures, working methodically through each room. The house seemed to respond to our efforts. Temperatures would drop suddenly, doors would creak open on their own, and we both heard footsteps in rooms we'd just left. But the activity felt different from what I'd expected based on the previous residents' accounts. There was no malevolence in it, no sense of threat. It felt more like curiosity, as if the spirits were trying to understand what we were doing. By evening, we'd completed the basic protections. The house was surrounded by salt barriers, iron symbols hung at key points, and I'd drawn specific protective circles in chalk around our bedroom and the kitchen. According to my research, these measures wouldn't prevent spiritual activity entirely, but they should protect us from direct physical harm. We ordered pizza for dinner, eating off paper plates in the living room while we discussed our next steps. The house was quiet around us, but I could feel the presence of the ghosts like a weight in the air. "Tell me about the ritual," Rebecca said. "How exactly do we free them?" I pulled out Dr. Whitmore's journal, which I'd had professionally photocopied and bound. According to his research, the binding ritual created what he called spiritual anchors, physical objects that tied the children's souls to the house. We need to find these anchors and destroy them in a specific sequence. The anchors were described as small objects that had been taken from each victim and incorporated into the house's structure. Toys, pieces of clothing, locks of hair, personal items that had been important to the children when they were alive. Crowley hid them in the walls when the house was built, I continued. Dr. Whitmore found several of them, but he died before he could complete the ritual. We need to find the ones he missed. Rebecca studied the journal pages. How do we know which ones are anchors? They'll be in the hidden rooms, behind the basement walls, and according to Whitmore's notes, they'll be active, warm to the touch, or vibrating, or showing other signs of spiritual energy. I'd also found references to the reversal ritual itself. It required specific words to be spoken, symbols to be drawn, and the anchors to be destroyed in the order the children had been killed. The ritual had to be performed at midnight on the anniversary of the original fire, November 3rd, which was still 2 weeks away. "What happens if we get it wrong?" Rebecca asked. I'd been dreading this question. According to the sources I found, a failed ritual could make the binding permanent. The spirits would be trapped forever, and the house would become even more dangerous. We spent the evening reading through Dr. Whitmore's notes, trying to understand exactly what we'd be attempting. The ritual was complex, requiring precise timing and specific materials. We'd need to gather herbs that were difficult to find, candles made from particular types of wax, and salt that had been blessed according to specific religious traditions. But the most challenging part would be entering the hidden rooms in the basement. Dr. Whitmore's notes made it clear that these spaces were the focal points of the spiritual activity. They were where the children had been killed, where their bodies had been hidden, and where their spirits were most strongly bound. "We'll need to be very careful," I said. "The closer we get to November 3rd, the more active the spirits are likely to become." Other families reported that the phenomena intensified right before they left. Rebecca nodded, but I could see the determination in her eyes. "We're not other families. We're here to help them, not to be driven away." That night, we slept in the master bedroom with salt lines across the doorway and iron symbols hanging on the walls. The house was quiet at first, but around 2 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of children playing. I lay in bed listening to voices in the hallway outside our room. They were young voices, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and they seemed to be playing some kind of game. I could hear laughter, running footsteps, and what sounded like hide and seek. Rebecca was awake too, listening to the same sounds. "Should we go look?" she whispered. I thought about it, but decided against it. We weren't ready for direct contact yet. We needed to complete our preparations first. The sounds continued for about an hour, then faded away. In the morning, I found small footprints in the dust on the hardwood floors of the hallway. They led from the top of the stairs to our bedroom door, where they stopped at the salt line. "They're testing the boundaries," Rebecca said when I showed her the prints, "seeing what they can and can't do." Over the next few days, the activity increased gradually. We'd hear voices in empty rooms, find toys that we hadn't brought with us, and occasionally catch glimpses of movement in our peripheral vision. But nothing crossed the salt lines, and nothing attempted to harm us directly. I spent most of my time in the basement, examining the hidden rooms and trying to understand the layout of Crowley's ritual space. The 3 rooms I'd found were connected by narrow passages, and each one showed evidence of the terrible things that had happened there. The walls were covered in symbols that had been carved directly into the stone. Some were recognizable occult markings, but others were unlike anything I'd seen in my research. They seemed to pulse with their own light, and touching them made my skin crawl. In the first room, I found the remains of what appeared to be an altar. It was made of black stone and was stained with something that looked like dried blood. Around it were arranged 7 small objects: a doll, a wooden horse, a child's shoe, a brass button, a hair ribbon, a toy soldier, and a small book. These were the anchors Dr. Whitmore had written about. Each one represented a child who had died in this room, and each one was warm to the touch despite the cold air. When I held them, I could feel something like a heartbeat, and I swear I heard whispered voices pleading for help. The second room contained more anchors, 12 of them, arranged in a circle around what looked like a ritual fire pit. The third room had the most, 15 anchors surrounding a stone chair that was covered in restraints and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. 34 anchors in total, representing 34 children who had died in unimaginable terror. Each one was a key to freeing a trapped soul, and each one would need to be destroyed in exactly the right sequence. I photographed everything, measured the rooms carefully, and began the process of identifying which anchor belonged to which child. Dr. Whitmore's notes contained descriptions of some of the victims, and I cross-referenced these with the missing person reports I'd found in the city archives. The work was emotionally exhausting. Each anchor represented a real child who had lived and died in this house. I found myself thinking about their families, their friends, their lives that had been cut short by Jeremiah Crowley's madness. But I also began to understand something that Dr. Whitmore had only hinted at in his notes. The children weren't just trapped, they were aware. They knew what had happened to them, they knew how much time had passed, and they knew that we were there to help them. On the 5th day after we'd moved in, I found a message written in the dust on the basement floor. "Thank you for coming." The handwriting was small and careful, like a child's. Below it were 34 small handprints, each one different, each one representing a soul that had been waiting more than a century for someone to care enough to help them. I called Rebecca down to see the message. When she saw it, she began to cry. "We're going to free them," she said. "All of them, no matter what it takes." I nodded, but I was beginning to understand that the cost might be higher than we'd anticipated. The research I'd done had focused on the mechanical aspects of the ritual, but I hadn't fully considered the emotional toll. Living in a house with 34 murdered children was changing us in ways I hadn't expected. We were becoming part of their story, and they were becoming part of ours. With 1 week left before November 3rd, we began the final preparations for the ritual. But first, we needed to gather the materials we'd need, and some of them were going to be very difficult to find. The week before November 3rd was the longest of my life. Every day brought new challenges as we tried to gather the materials needed for the ritual, and every night brought increasingly intense spiritual activity as the anniversary approached. I'd made a list of required items based on Dr. Whitmore's notes and the additional research I'd done. Some were simple: white candles, sea salt, sage for cleansing. Others were nearly impossible to find in a modern city. The most critical item was something called blessed silver, silver that had been consecrated according to specific religious traditions and had never been used for secular purposes. According to the ritual instructions, this silver needed to be melted down and poured over each anchor as it was destroyed. I found a Catholic supply store downtown that specialized in religious artifacts. The owner, an elderly man named Father Martinez, listened to my carefully rehearsed story about needing blessed silver for a family blessing ceremony. "This is not something we typically sell to lay people," he said, studying me carefully. "May I ask why you need it?" I'd prepared for this question. "My wife and I have inherited a house with a difficult history. We want to cleanse it before we start our family." Father Martinez nodded slowly. "The house on Sycamore Street." I was surprised that he knew. "Yes, how did you—" "I've been asked about that house before. Several times, actually, always by people who thought they could fix what was wrong with it." He paused, looking at me intently. "They all failed. We're not trying to fix it," I said. "We're trying to free the souls that are trapped there." Father Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Then he went into a back room and returned with a small silver cross. "This was blessed by Cardinal Murphy in 1962, he said. "It's been used only for exorcisms and consecrations. If you're truly trying to help those poor children, it might be what you need." I tried to pay him, but he refused to accept money. "Some things are too important for commerce," he said. "But I want you to know, what you're attempting is dangerous. Not just spiritually, but physically. The forces you're dealing with have had more than a century to grow stronger." I thanked him and left with the silver cross. But his words stayed with me. Every source I'd consulted had warned about the dangers of the ritual, but I was beginning to understand that the warnings might have been understated. The other materials were easier to find. I located a specialty shop that sold herbs and oils used in various spiritual traditions. The owner, a woman who introduced herself only as Madame Vera, seemed to know exactly what I was looking for. "You're dealing with bound spirits," she said, not making it a question. "Child spirits, from the feel of it." I nodded, wondering how she could know so much from the list of herbs I'd given her. "Child spirits are different," she continued, gathering items from shelves lined with bottles and jars. "They're more powerful than adult spirits, but also more vulnerable. They can be freed, but the process will be traumatic for everyone involved." She handed me a bag containing sage, lavender, rosemary, and several other herbs I didn't recognize. "Burn these in the ritual space before you begin. They'll help calm the spirits and make the process less violent." "Violent?" I asked. "When you break the binding, you'll be releasing more than a century of accumulated pain and rage. The spirits will be confused, possibly angry. They might not understand that you're trying to help them." Madame Vera also gave me a small bottle of what she called protection oil, a blend of herbs and oils that was supposed to shield the living from spiritual backlash. She showed me how to apply it to my forehead, wrists, and heart. "Use this on yourself and your wife before you begin," she said. "And remember, no matter what happens during the ritual, don't stop. If you leave the process incomplete, the spirits will be in worse condition than before." The final item on my list was the most difficult to obtain. The ritual required earth from a consecrated ground, soil that had been blessed and had never been touched by violence. I'd tried several cemeteries, but none of them met the criteria. Finally, I remembered a small church in the countryside where Rebecca and I had attended a wedding the previous year. The church had been built in the 1800s and was surrounded by a garden that had been maintained by nuns for generations. If anywhere qualified as truly consecrated ground, it would be there. I drove out to the church on Thursday evening, hoping to find the priest or someone who could help me. The church was locked, but I found an elderly nun tending the garden behind the building. "I need your help," I said, introducing myself. "I'm trying to free the souls of children who were murdered more than a century ago." The nun, Sister Catherine, listened to my story without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I know about the house you're talking about," she said finally. "We've been praying for those children for years. Every November 3rd, we hold a special mass for their souls." She led me to a corner of the garden where a small shrine had been built. "This ground has been blessed every year since 1894. It's never known violence, never been touched by evil. Take what you need." I filled a small container with soil from around the shrine, and Sister Catherine blessed it with a prayer in Latin. As she spoke, I felt a warmth spread through my chest, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly hopeful. "You're taking a great risk," she said as I prepared to leave. "But those children have been waiting so long for someone to help them. God will protect you if your intentions are pure. I returned to the house with all the materials we'd need for the ritual. Rebecca had spent the day preparing the basement, clearing out the hidden rooms, and drawing the protective symbols Dr. Whitmore had specified. The spiritual activity in the house had intensified dramatically. We could hear children's voices constantly now, not just at night, but throughout the day. They seemed to be getting more excited as November 3rd approached, as if they knew their freedom was near. But there were also signs of something else, a darker presence that seemed opposed to our efforts. Doors would slam shut when we tried to enter certain rooms, the temperature would drop suddenly, and we'd both experience the sensation of being watched by something hostile. "It's Crowley," Rebecca said on Friday night as we sat in the living room reviewing the ritual procedures. "His spirit is still here too, and he doesn't want us to free the children." I'd suspected as much. Dr. Whitmore's notes had hinted that Crowley's spirit was bound to the house as well, not as a prisoner, but as a guardian. He designed the binding ritual to ensure that he could continue to feed off the children's spiritual energy, even after death. "Will the ritual free him too?" Rebecca asked. I shook my head. According to Whitmore, Crowley's binding is different. He chose to be bound to the house. The ritual will only free the unwilling prisoners. That night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I was in the basement standing in the first hidden room, but it looked different. The walls were clean, the floor was polished, and candles provided warm light. A man was standing near the altar, tall, well-dressed, with dark hair and cold eyes. He was holding a small girl's hand, and she was crying. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, looking directly at me. "These children belong to me. I've fed on their fear for more than a century, and I won't let you take them." The little girl looked up at me with pleading eyes. "Please help us," she whispered. "We've been so cold for so long." I woke up with tears on my face and the absolute certainty that we were doing the right thing, no matter how dangerous it might be. Saturday, November 2nd, we spent the entire day in final preparations. I melted down the blessed silver cross, creating small silver discs that would be placed on each anchor during the ritual. Rebecca arranged the herbs and oils in the basement, creating a cleansing circle around the entrance to the hidden rooms. The house was in chaos. Doors opened and closed constantly. We could hear footsteps in every room, and the temperature fluctuated wildly. But through it all, we could feel the children's presence, not threatening, but eager and hopeful. That evening, we tried to eat dinner, but neither of us had much appetite. We were both nervous about what we'd be attempting in a few hours, and the house's activity was making it impossible to relax. "Are you ready for this?" Rebecca asked. I looked around the living room, noting the toys that had appeared overnight, the small handprints on the windows, the sense of anticipation that filled the air. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," I said, "but we're going to do it anyway." At 11:30 p.m., we went down to the basement to begin the ritual. The hidden rooms had been transformed by our preparations. Candles provided flickering light, herbs burned in small dishes, and the protective symbols we'd drawn seemed to glow with their own energy. The anchors were arranged in the order Dr. Whitmore had specified, and the blessed silver discs were ready. Everything was prepared for the most important night of our lives. As midnight approached, we stood in the first hidden room, surrounded by the spirits of 34 murdered children. I could feel their presence more strongly than ever before, not as ghosts, but as real, living souls who had been trapped for too long. "It's time," I said, opening Dr. Whitmore's journal to the ritual instructions. Rebecca lit the final candle, and we began the process that would either free the children or doom them to eternal imprisonment. The ritual was about to begin. At exactly midnight on November 3rd, I began reading from Dr. Whitmore's journal. The words were a mixture of Latin and English, some of which I didn't understand but spoke anyway, trusting that the sounds themselves carried the power needed to break the binding. "Spiritus innocentium, audit nos," I began, my voice echoing in the small stone room. "Hear us, innocent souls. We come not as your captors, but as your liberators." The effect was immediate. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly that frost began forming on the walls. The candles flickered but didn't go out, and I could hear whispers in the air around us, children's voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Rebecca stood beside me, holding the first anchor, a small wooden doll with blonde hair and a blue dress. According to Dr. Whitmore's notes, this had belonged to Mary Sullivan, age 7, who had disappeared in March 1897. Mary Sullivan, I continued, following the ritual text. We call your name. We acknowledge your suffering. We offer you freedom. The doll in Rebecca's hands began to glow with a soft light. As I placed the first silver disc on it, the light intensified, and I could swear I heard a child's voice whisper, "Thank you." But as I began to melt the silver disc with the consecrated flame, something else happened. The room filled with a presence that was entirely different from the children, older, angrier, and completely malevolent. "You will not take them from me," a voice said. It was deep and commanding, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "They are mine. They have always been mine." The walls began to shake, and several of the candles went out. In the darkness, I could see a figure standing in the corner of the room, tall, well-dressed, with the same cold eyes I'd seen in my dream. Jeremiah Crowley. "Continue the ritual," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "Don't let him stop us." I kept reading from the journal, but it was becoming difficult to concentrate. The shaking was getting worse, and I could hear children screaming. Not the voices of the bound spirits, but the sounds of their deaths, replaying like echoes from the past. The silver disc melted completely, and the wooden doll crumbled to ash. At the same moment, a brilliant light filled the room, and I felt something pass through me, a sense of joy and freedom that was overwhelming. Mary Sullivan was free. But Crowley's spirit was fighting back. The remaining anchors began to shake and rattle, and the temperature continued to drop. I could see my breath in the air, and frost was forming on the floor. "Second anchor," I called to Rebecca, trying to be heard over the sound of the wind that had begun howling through the room. She handed me a toy soldier made of lead. Timothy Morrison, age 6, disappeared August 1897. As I began the ritual for the second child, Crowley's presence became more aggressive. The walls around us began to bleed. Not blood, but the same dark substance I'd seen on the scratch marks upstairs. The smell was overwhelming, like rotting meat and sulfur. "Timothy Morrison," I said, placing the silver disc on the toy soldier. "We call your name. We acknowledge your suffering. We offer you freedom." The soldier began to glow, but this time, Crowley tried to interfere directly. I felt invisible hands grab my wrists, trying to pull me away from the altar. The grip was impossibly strong, and I could feel my bones grinding together. "He's trying to stop the ritual," I told Rebecca. "Keep going, no matter what happens to me." She nodded and took the journal, continuing to read while I struggled with the invisible force that was trying to drag me away from the altar. The silver disc melted, the toy soldier crumbled, and another spirit was freed. But each liberation seemed to make Crowley stronger. By the time we reached the fifth anchor, the entire room was shaking so violently that I could barely stand. The bleeding walls were getting worse, and I could hear Crowley's voice screaming in rage. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted. "Without the children, the house will collapse. The binding holds more than just their spirits. It holds the fabric of reality itself." I didn't know if he was telling the truth or lying to stop us, but I knew we couldn't quit now. We'd freed 5 children, but 29 more were still trapped. As we moved to the second room, the spiritual activity intensified even further. The ghosts of the freed children were still present, but they seemed different now. Stronger, more solid, more alive. They were trying to help us, standing between us and Crowley's attacks. "The children are protecting us," Rebecca said, and I could see it too. 5 small figures standing in a circle around us, their eyes glowing with the same light we'd seen when they were freed. We continued the ritual, working through the anchors in the second room. Each liberation was a battle, with Crowley's spirit fighting more desperately to stop us. But the freed children were helping, and their combined strength was greater than his. By the time we reached the third room, we had freed 18 children. But we were both exhausted, and the house around us was falling apart. The walls were cracking, the ceiling was sagging, and I could hear the sound of timber groaning under stress. "He was telling the truth," I said, looking at the damage around us. The binding was holding the house together, Without it, the whole structure is going to collapse. Rebecca looked at the remaining 16 anchors. We can't stop now. If we leave them trapped, they'll die when the house falls. She was right. We'd come too far to quit, even if it meant risking our own lives. We had to free all the children, no matter what happened to us. The final 16 liberations were the most difficult. Crowley's spirit was no longer just trying to stop us. It was trying to destroy us. The room filled with illusions designed to confuse and terrify us. We saw the children's deaths replaying over and over. We heard their screams, and we felt their pain as if it were our own. But we kept going. One by one, the final anchors were destroyed. One by one, the remaining children were freed. And as each spirit was liberated, they joined the circle of protection around us. The final anchor belonged to a little girl named Susan Carter, age 5, who had been Crowley's last victim before the fire. Her anchor was a small brass locket that had been given to her by her grandmother. As I placed the silver disc on the locket, Crowley made one final attempt to stop us. The entire room exploded in supernatural fury. The walls cracked open, the ceiling collapsed, and I felt myself being lifted off the ground by invisible forces. But 33 freed children stood between us and Crowley's rage. Their combined strength was more than enough to hold him back while we completed the ritual. The silver disc melted, the locket crumbled, and Susan Carter was free. For a moment, the room was filled with absolute silence. Then slowly, the 34 children began to fade. But before they disappeared entirely, each one turned to us and smiled. "Thank you," they said in unison, their voices like music. "We can go home now." As the last child faded from view, the house around us began to collapse in earnest. The binding that had held everything together was broken, and more than a century of accumulated damage was catching up all at once. "We need to get out," Rebecca said, grabbing my hand. We ran through the collapsing basement, dodging falling beams and chunks of stone. The stairs to the first floor were intact, but barely. As we reached the top, I could hear the basement ceiling give way behind us. The first floor was in chaos. Windows were shattering, walls were cracking, and the entire structure was groaning like a living thing in pain. We made it to the front door just as the staircase to the second floor collapsed. Outside, we stood on the sidewalk and watched the house destroy itself. It didn't collapse all at once, but slowly, room by room, as if it were dying rather than simply falling down. As we watched, I thought I saw a figure in one of the upstairs windows. Tall, well-dressed, with cold eyes. Jeremiah Crowley, trapped in his collapsing prison, finally getting the punishment he deserved. The house took almost an hour to fall completely. When it was over, nothing remained but a pile of rubble and a basement full of broken stone. The entire lot looked like it had been hit by an earthquake. We called the fire department, telling them we'd heard a loud crash and seen the house collapse. They responded quickly, but there was nothing they could do except secure the site and make sure no one was trapped in the rubble. "Good thing no one was living there," one of the firefighters said. "That place has been trouble for years." Rebecca and I looked at each other but didn't say anything. We'd succeeded in freeing the children, but we'd also destroyed the house in the process. The property was worthless now, and we'd lost everything we'd invested in it. But as we stood watching the emergency crews work, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The oppressive weight that had hung over the neighborhood for more than a century was gone. The air felt cleaner, the shadows seemed less dark, and I could swear I heard the sound of children laughing in the distance. "Do you think they're really free?" Rebecca asked. I nodded. "I think they went where they were supposed to go a long time ago. They're with their families now." We stayed until the emergency crews finished their work, then walked back to our apartment. We'd lost our investment, but we'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that we'd done something that truly mattered. The next morning, the newspaper ran a story about the mysterious collapse of the house on Sycamore Street. The reporter interviewed several neighbors, all of whom said they felt like a weight had been lifted from the neighborhood. "It's like the sun is brighter," one woman said. "I can't explain it, but the whole street feels different." Rebecca and I read the article together over breakfast, smiling at the confirmation that we'd succeeded. The children were free, Crowley was gone, and the house that had been a prison for more than a century was finally destroyed. But the story didn't end there. A week later, we received a letter from the estate of the house's owners. Inside was a check for $50,000. the insurance payout for the property's destruction. "We want you to have this," the letter said. "We know you lost everything when the house collapsed, and we feel responsible for not warning you about the risks. Use this money to start over somewhere else." We used the money to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood across town. It was built in the 1960s, had no tragic history, and felt completely normal. We've been living there for 6 months now, and neither of us has experienced anything supernatural. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, I think I can hear the sound of children playing in the distance. Happy children, laughing and running free. And I know that somewhere, 34 souls who had been trapped for more than a century are finally at peace. The house on Sycamore Street is gone, but the children it imprisoned are free. And sometimes that's all the victory you need. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Unfortunately, the channel is going through a tough time right now, and we really need your help to keep creating content that you love. If you can, please share our videos with your friends and family, and leave a comment to let us know what you think. Every little bit helps and keeps us motivated to bring you more great content. Thanks again for being part of our community, and we hope to see you in the next video.